Hey, Marcus House with you here, and welcome to episode 27 in our Quick Progression series. Today we are going to talk about the new communication systems in Kerbal Space Program 1.2. In the ComNet options, we can turn on Require Signal for Control and turn off the Enable Extra Ground Stations option for an extra challenge in the game. Just to do a little demonstration, we'll start a new sandbox game here. Thanks there to Gene Kerman for the introduction, and we'll head into the vehicle assembly building. After quickly building a little test vessel here, we've gone straight out to the launch pad and we're going to launch this little satellite up into orbit just to demonstrate a few things. We have two Communitron HG55 units here, somewhat mimicking Princess Leia, and what we're going to do is just demonstrate that this is going to have communication problems around Kerbal whilst in orbit. There's nothing overly special about this unit. It's got a Deorbiting OKTO2 unit, along with some solar panels, battery, and the communication devices, obviously. Deploying all that there, and essentially what I want to demonstrate here is our limited connectivity with the Kerbal Space Center. We should only be able to connect to the KSC with line of sight, which does beg the question why we can do it right now with the ocean in the way. Now, because I've got all the other ground stations turned off, there is actually no other opportunity to connect back until we make a full orbit back around Kerbal to come up close to the KSC again. Up there in the top right, you can see the little red icon indicating that we have no connection back to Kerbal. Now, by default, the Require Signal for Control option is turned off, so that means you can still have limited control of your vessels when you don't have this connection available to you. But logically, I think this is a good option to have on by default because it does more accurately mimic real life. So switching back now to our regular save game where we have been doing our Quick Progression series, and what we're going to be doing today is talking specifically about geosynchronous and geostationary orbits. If you'd already unlocked your tech tree, you'll notice that there's actually a few parts missing, so we can buy those. Firstly, the Engineering 101 tier's got a few parts we're missing. Also a few parts there under survivability that we needed to unlock. I suspect there was probably a bunch of different parts here that were probably revamped and therefore not matching some of the previously unlocked item names that we've already unlocked here. Obviously a lot of these being the new communication systems. Just quickly double checking that I've picked everything up and unlocked everything. That's looking pretty good. Think I've got everything, so we'll leave the facility. Jumping straight into the vehicle assembly building, and what we're going to do is build up a communication satellite network all in the one rocket launch. We'll just give the vessel a name, we'll call it the GeoSat network. Already added the largest remote guidance unit, and we're going to add under here a Rockermax X200-16 fuel tank. A Poodle engine there to power that stage, and obviously this is going to be our booster. We're going to pop on a decoupler and then take a couple of the large orange fuel tanks and a mainsail engine underneath that. Now the cool part, we're going to grab the largest protective shell fairing we can grab, the 3.75 meter. And now we're going to start building our satellite on top of that, so the decoupler first there. These satellites are going to be powered by the Dawn electric propulsion ion drives. These are of course fueled by the Xenon tanks, so we're going to grab two of those. Above that, for easy control, we're going to add a small inline reaction wheel. And of course we need some battery storage, so we're going to grab a small battery to stick on top there. Essentially we want all of these satellites to be relay satellites, so we're going to grab the second largest relay antenna. That should be big enough, and it's still going to fit here. So the RA15 will suit us here. The problem is though, is that we can't stack it on top without it actually interfering with this new truss attachment point. The truss is actually the awesome part I wanted to actually demonstrate, but we'll first add a Deorbiting OKTO2 unit here. And just so that I can keep building the satellite here, I'm just going to reroute this so that the OKTO2 is actually the root part for this just temporarily. We'll just add a Communitron 16 antenna just for direct communication with Kerbal. Two Gigantor XL solar arrays, and we'll just flip those around so they're pointing out horizontally there. There we go, beautiful. So we're going to actually re-dock the decoupler back here, and we'll actually reroute the whole thing back to the larger booster remote guidance unit. So here's the cool part, we can actually duplicate now our satellite and we can actually stack them up on the truss segments of the fairing, and we can stack 4 of these up on top of each other until we get up to the limits of those truss segments. We'll set our fairing onto a clamshell deploy with just 2 sides to it, and we'll now just build the fairing right up over the top of all the truss segments and just cap it off up on top there. So there we go, we've got 4 of our relay satellites stacked neatly inside our fairing. For some reason there, my staging has gotten itself all messed up, so we want to just readjust this, making sure of course that the mainsail engine for the booster is firing first, then our decoupler and fairings, and then the poodle engine. And everything else up above here is going to be manually fired and decoupled anyway. Out on the launch pad and firing there. With the 1.2 release, I'm sure a lot of you have noticed that the stability assist now performs much better. It doesn't go swinging back and forwards across the maneuver node. Hitting that prograde marker there, it's just stable. In previous releases, you would have seen here the mainsail engine flicking wildly back and forward trying to overcorrect itself. It doesn't do that anymore, so I'm super excited about that. So while we're launching, we can talk a little about why you would want a geostationary positioned satellite in the first place. So a geostationary orbit is a perfectly circular orbit above a planet's equator, which is positioned at the exact distance needed to make one full orbit around at the same time that the planet rotates once around its axis. So a satellite in such an orbit will actually appear motionless in the sky to observers on the ground. Now, this is particularly useful for communication satellites and weather satellites as well, because ground stations can point at this non-moving satellite in the sky without needing to do any sort of tracking or constantly switching to other orbiting satellites. While I was rambling on there, I totally forgot to fire those fairings off in time, so that wasn't real efficient. A geostationary orbit is quite a large distance out from Kerbal, so the first step here, we're going to jump up to around 500 kilometers for our apoapsis, and we're going to then time warp up to the apoapsis marker to do our second burn to actually boost the opposite side of our orbit right up until we hit that geostationary altitude. Actually, now that I think about it, I probably should be calling it a geostationary orbit rather than a geostationary one. Geostationary obviously applies to the Earth, not Kerbal. Now, to determine the correct altitude to place your geostationary satellite, you can simply get this information off the Kerbal page on the Kerbal Space Program Wiki, and you're looking for the synchronous orbit stat that shows 2,863.35 kilometers. So we've got that almost perfect, doesn't need to be exact at this point, and we're just going to time warp now around to the apoapsis marker and then raise our periapsis to the exact same altitude so that we're perfectly circular. When our time to apoapsis is down to a few seconds, we're going to fire our engines there and raise that periapsis right up so that we have a perfectly circular orbit, or very close to one. There we go there, that's pretty close. What we can do at this point to just fine-tune that orbit is actually set our thrust limiter on the poodle engine right down, and we're going to make a few corrections. Currently our periapsis is just a little low, so we're doing a very small prograde burn here to raise that right up to 2,863.35 kilometers. Now, of course, we're going to do the same thing from the opposite side of the orbit. In this case, our actual apoapsis is now just a little too high, so we're going to do a slight retrograde adjustment to bring it down to that exact synchronous orbit altitude as well. So there we go there, exactly 2,863.3 kilometers on both sides of our orbit. Excellent. So as I deploy the solar panels, we'll switch to a time-lapse view here looking back at Kerbal, and you can see here as we rotate around in our orbit, the actual picture of Kerbal is staying perfectly static. We are not moving at all. From Kerbal's point of view, looking up into the sky, this satellite is sitting in the exact same spot. The Kerbal Engineer orbit panel here over on the right is essentially showing us a near exact orbital period of 5 hours 59 minutes, which is the Kerbal day. A moment ago you probably spotted another satellite in orbit around Kerbal. We're actually going to switch over to this one. This is a pre-1.2 satellite. We're going to actually deorbit this thing and turf it into the Kerbal atmosphere. Our new geostationary satellites that we're deploying here supersede this Sat-1 by quite a bit, so off we go with that. Now, why, you may ask, do I have 4 satellites ready to deploy here? This is essentially because I want to create 4 equal distance satellites around Kerbal To do this, we want to drop 1/4 of a day off our orbital period in between releasing each of our satellites, and to do this, we just need to make our orbit 3/4 of a Kerbal day. So this is pretty simple stuff, right? We know how long one day is, so to work out how much 3/4 of a day is, we just need to multiply the number of seconds in the day by 0.75, and there we go, we end up with 4 hours, 29 minutes, and 22.068 seconds. So that figure seems a little wacky until you realise that a Kerbal day is about 6 hours, not 24. Now before I release the first satellite, I'm going to be picky here and just again finely tune our orbital period so that it's exactly perfect. It's currently just a few seconds too long, so we're just doing a slight retrograde burn here just to bring it down from 59 minutes and 13 seconds down to 59 minutes and 9.4 seconds, which is the exact orbital period to match the Kerbal day. Now, for obvious reasons, it's more important for your orbital period to be absolutely spot on. If the apoapsis or periapsis marker isn't quite perfect on the altitude, that doesn't matter as much. Turning the vessel towards the normal marker, and we're going to release this first satellite. Even just decoupling will shift our orbital period just a bit, so turning in a normal or anti-normal direction is just going to limit this a little more. Okay, so we need to do this pretty precisely. What we're going to do is set our thrust limiter back up, and we're going to turn retrograde, and we're going to wipe 1/4 of a day off our orbital period to match that figure we saw earlier. Down we come here, and we're aiming for 4 hours, 29 minutes, and 22.06 seconds. So I've just overshot that a little. Turning prograde here, we're going to set that thrust limiter just right down again so that we can make a fine adjustment to get this 3/4 day orbit perfect. So just raising that up just a little. And there we go, 4 hours, 29 minutes, and 22.0 seconds. That is near perfect. So what we want to do now is time warp ahead to our apoapsis marker after a full orbit, and this is going to drop us 1/4 orbit ahead of our previously released satellite. Of course, now that we are 1/4 orbit ahead, we need to now rematch our orbital period back to the full Kerbal day. Then we're going to release our next satellite. So you may be still wondering if there is a real reason to set up a geostationary satellite network, and the short answer is no, not really. This is simply a good thing to demonstrate because that's what we do here on Earth for a lot of really good reasons. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't set up a general satellite network around Kerbal or any other planet for that matter. In the case where you're playing with the Enable Extra Ground Stations option turned off, you need to have multiple relay satellites orbiting around Kerbal just to ensure that you never have any black spots when communicating back and forward between your vessels and the KSC. So our orbit is readjusted back up to exactly 1 day, and we've got our 2 satellites exactly 1/4 of an orbit apart. That's really cool. So what we now want to do is basically drop the second satellite here. So we're going to bring in those solar panels, again turning to our normal marker, anti-normal marker actually this time, and we'll decouple this satellite and see if we can get it out here between the truss segments of the fairing. Now, how do I get this thing out of here? Okay. Turning it that way? No, maybe the other way? There we go, that's not too bad. We'll extend out our solar panel. Oh, actually, oh jeez, I let them out a bit early. Whoops. Oh, that's made it much worse. Oh, what was I thinking? Okay, with that out of the way, we're going to rinse and repeat this whole process 2 more times. So, of course, first, reducing 1/4 of a day off our orbit. Aiming here again for 4 hours, 29 minutes, and 22.0 seconds. And I've overshot it again. Great, okay, so as I'm adjusting this, I'll just explain a little about the differences between the relay satellite dishes and the other direct communication antennas. It's actually quite simple. A relay satellite dish is only used to receive and retransmit a signal that's coming to it, whereas normally you will need a direct method of communication using a direct antenna to actually communicate with either a relay or the KSC directly. Shadow Zone did an episode recently demonstrating just this thing, so here is a link if you want to see more about that. It explains a lot about the different ranges on different dishes, so it's quite handy. Just getting ready to deploy our third satellite here. pointing there in a normal direction. You can see there when we look at map view, we have our 3 satellites equally spaced around Kerbal so far. So I'll see if I can do this a bit better this time and move the truss out of the way at the same time. And yes, that's much better. I like that. Again, we'll just activate those ion thrusters on this vessel and just get ourselves just slightly out of the way, then just turning back and wiping off any of that relative velocity. Now we can just pretty much extend out those solar panels and point ourselves towards Kerbal for a nice strong signal. Now it is possible as well to keep the 3/4 day orbit and just release a satellite each time around, but the reason I'm not doing that is because this vessel's got plenty of delta V to move back and forward each time we come around our orbit, so it seems a waste to not use that delta V, and it leaves more fuel in each of our little satellites because they're basically not needing to spend any fuel initially. The satellites, of course, will be able to run for many years with the amount of xenon fuel they've got available to them. And in real life, satellites need to fairly frequently reposition themselves just slightly to keep themselves at a perfect orbit. For that reason, having a whole bunch of delta V available to each one of our satellites is a very important thing in the long term. Making our last 3/4 orbit here and getting ready to release our final 4th satellite into a perfect position. Again, just turning prograde and doing a small burn to get us up to that full day orbital period. So yeah, the reason why a satellite needs to frequently make small correction burns to keep it in place is because of a number of factors. Firstly, there are constant small deviations coming from gravitational forces from the moon and the sun, and there's even small effects from things like solar radiation pressure, as well as even some air drag, especially for those satellites that are in lower orbits. So for this reason, the satellite can only remain in orbit until the fuel runs out. So just getting ready to release that final satellite. We'll first retract those solar panels, bring those in there, and again try to decouple and move the truss area out of the way at the same time. Oh, I think I did give it a bit of a nudge. So there we go, our 4th satellite is now out in our series of geostationary satellites. Pop out those solar panels there and we'll just do a small correction to get this back up at the exact single day orbital period. There we go there, that's pretty much perfect. So now what we're going to do is actually deorbit our little booster stage with the empty truss segments to it. Just going to do a retrograde burn here, of course, until we drop our orbit lines into Kerbal's atmosphere. So that's going to dispose of that nicely. So now when we head back into the tracking station and have a look at our orbital lines for all of our satellites, you can see there that beautiful pattern. The 4 geostationary satellites orbiting beautifully there together. So even if we do have our extra ground stations option turned off there in settings, we can always now communicate with any other vessel that's on the ground on Kerbal or even in low Kerbal orbit. So you can see here it's possible to set up synchronous orbits around Minmus, around Elu, also Eve's a great one, it's a fair way out there, also Dres, and surprisingly you can even do this around Joule, even though you would expect a lot of the outer bodies of Joule to actually keep on messing up your orbits. So there are other types of synchronous orbits that you can set up that aren't actually stationary ones. This one here, what we're going to do is bring this right down to around 500 kilometers. Now this synchronous orbit we're going to set up here is going to allow the vessel to pass over the same periapsis point over Kerbal each day, whilst also heading then up to a much higher apoapsis so we can observe Kerbal at a much further distance, and we can do this all in one orbital day. So just burning here to raise the apoapsis up until our orbital period becomes that familiar 5 hours and 59 minutes. So there we go there, you'll see as we make multiple orbits around, we're essentially launching way up to take a long shot back at Kerbal, and then we're coming back down really quickly and passing over that same continent. So we'll pass that area on the ground every day at the exact same point, but what you'll also notice is that Kerbal will at one point spin in the opposite direction, slow down and stop, and then spin the other direction. This sort of orbit could be particularly useful if you want to take nice close-up scans of a city or something close up, and then later in the day take some scans further out of another slightly different part of the planet. So I hope you enjoyed that video. If you have any questions for me, whack them down in the comments below. Thanks very much to all of you that have subscribed, and for those that haven't, please do subscribe to see more. Follow me on Twitter at MarcusHouseGame, and we'll see you in the next video. First though, we're going to give it a name, and we're going to name it after the Prosperity space station. Prosperoid? I don't know. That doesn't seem quite right. It seems like some sort of hemorrhoid cream. Nevertheless, Prosperoid it is. So yes, we've got a great refueling depot here at the asteroid. We can convert 87% of the mass of that asteroid into ore, which we can then convert to any of our fuel types. So that is a great reason to have this thing around Kerbal.